In this video, I'm going to be talking about how I passed the AWS Solutions Architect exam. And I can't get specific, but what I can do is talk about my own personal study strategies and what I would strongly encourage anyone considering this exam should do. So, to begin with, AWS has these public available official documents, their exam guides. So, you should guide all of your studying around this specific document because they're telling you exactly the domains that they want to see you have experience with. They tell you at the bottom of this document all of the different services that you need to have familiarity with. In terms of how you go about studying, it should all be based on this document because there's tons of videos and lectures and resources that you can just dive super deep into. But at the end of the day, it's really about working backwards, in my opinion, from the document right here. Just be super familiar with every single word you see. But it's a balance because there's dozens, hundreds of AWS services on this page that you're like you need to know, but at the same time you can spend dozens of hours just on one of those specific services. So that's where looking through all these different domains becomes super important. And they literally give you a breakdown, and this document changes as they update the exam. So again, please reference that most recent official AWS documentation. But in our case, you can see that a huge part of this exam talks about designing secure architectures, resilient, high performance. So the whole point of AWS is, being able to elastically scale instances, an RDS cluster, these types of things. So, the specific exam, again, look at this document, drills in on, specific areas. So if we're talking about how to host compute resources, obviously we're going to be talking a lot about EC2. If we're talking about how to cost effectively store stuff, we're going to be talking about S3. Within S3, you've got different types of tiers of service depending on how frequently you need to access this data. There is a lot of work that you can do to focus your studying around this thing. So to talk about myself for a little bit and my own personal strategy here, like I worked at Amazon. I was in the EC2 team at AWS. I was specifically working on instance remediation. So I was a very small cog in a very big machine. So I had some familiarity with EC2 walking into this exam, but I did not know the breadth of, the expectations for, what you need to know to pass. So, a huge part of computing and AWS is networking. So setting up a VPC, putting subnets out there that are public and private, making sure that these can all talk to each other. That's not a specific AWS service, but that's just foundational network information or knowledge that I personally really was lacking in. So in terms of how I personally studied for this exam, I focused a lot on I would use ChatGPT to try to make sure I understood everything that was involved in how to get an EC2 instance on a private subnet to be able to get updates from the internet, or for Route 53 and DNS records, what happens when I type in abc.com, where does it go from the DNS resolver to the root DNS server, the TLD DNS server. There's a whole story involved in the authoritative DNS server. That whole story, very important networking stuff that I didn't have, but you need to have that kind of familiarity with it to take this exam. And then also, it's one thing to have a perfect memory. So even if you could memorize everything on this page and all the services, reasoning comes into the picture a lot because given different scenarios, especially as a solutions architect, you're going to have to figure out what is the best services to use, because you can do the same thing in AWS in many different ways. If I just wanted to run some Python script, yes, I can go through the pain and suffering of spinning up an EKS cluster, making a Docker image, deploying that Docker image to all my containers, and do all that work. Or you could just do a Lambda function. So when would you want to go with either of those situations? And what if you have a thing that's going to run for longer than 15 minutes, which is the limit of Lambda? So now what type of other AWS services should you be looking into? So it's that's the type of level of understanding you need to know. Like you can't just know that like, oh, there's Fargate, so just memorize what Fargate, like the flashcard, because I made a lot of flashcards for this because there's a lot of words that like I wasn't familiar with. But it's not just memorizing it; it's really being able to think to that second level of, given this scenario where we want to do this as cost effectively as possible, or you want to minimize your operational overhead. What options are best. And so that's where you need to kind of be ready and performing at for these types of exams. And they tell you this in this document, so I'm sorry if this video is kind of boring, but honestly, if I was to retake this exam, all of my time, especially early on, should just be looking at this document. And then when you find yourselves in a 2-hour lecture video on S3, you can be like, okay, but I know that S3 is important because that's a huge part of how we make sure that, we can make data globally accessible or regionally accessible. And so like, that's just make sure that like you're focused in it. And then, and this is just straight up general test taking advice I find useful for myself, which is like sign up for an exam date and then hold yourself accountable for it. Because I'm definitely guilty of procrastinating and doing other projects. So like in my case, I picked a test date and I just crammed and I didn't have much wiggle room. So I was pretty stressed out, but that's just how I perform and what I need to get this done. Otherwise I would just be like, oh yeah, I'll take it someday and never actually get around to it. So put yourself on a time crunch, and then cram. If you're someone who's walking into this, like you don't know anything about AWS in general, I can't recommend that this is like the first certification you necessarily go for. It can be, but you're just gonna have to really familiarize yourself with a lot of kind of foundational stuff, in the sense of like really go through all the labs you possibly can, and see what it's like to spin up an EC2 instance. How do you make calls to it from a different computer on the internet? How do you make calls to it from a different EC2 instance on a different subnet in your VPC? Like, try to make it harder and harder on yourself to set up these situations where, you get to really actually use all these words, because like you'll learn EC2, you'll learn all the different pricing options of EC2, and it's like, okay, who cares? But it's like it matters on these tests because they'll describe a situation where the customer really just wants to have there's EC2 options where there's unpredictable spikes in customer traffic, and so what types of instances would you be using in those scenarios? Or what if it's pretty regular that your spikes happen? Then you can take advantage of other types of pricing models. So just kind of got to jump into it and look at what areas are the most focused on and kind of really hit those hard. At the very least, try to see all the words or all the different AWS services once, and ideally you have some kind of general idea of what it does. But so yeah, I'm kind of trying to be really careful here not to say the wrong thing or say stuff I shouldn't. But yeah, the exam is tough. Like I can't talk too much specifically about it, but I can't say it's an easy test, for me at least speaking. Like you really need to have that second level understanding of it, not just, okay, I know what it is, I know what it is and why I would use it, versus like a different service that could do exactly the same thing. So it's like that level of understanding is needed. And again, this is an associate's level exam, so it's not like super deep to the point where you're having to I can't comment too much on it, but basically, like if you find yourself trying to memorize a bunch of commands and numbers, I think you're going too deep personally, because again, as stated in this document, it's really kind of testing your understanding and just making sure that like, given 4 possible ways of doing something, that there's one way that's better than the other 4, and that's kind of what they're testing you on. So I hope this video is helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, but I hope everyone out there is doing well, and take it easy.